Hello, Rebecca. So tonight I have an article I wrote, and it might be one that you find interesting. If you're trying to go to sleep, maybe you want to pick a different track. But here you go. Did your school happen to teach the opposing arguments to the American Revolution? Did you get the whole story, or did they just teach you the Federalist Papers? The doctrine of default republicanism is host to a myriad of flaws and sketchy justifications for its necessity and its existence. Yet, it's rarely questioned in the American mindset or evaluated for and on its own merits, and I think this is the reason why. Reading a lot of royalist writings from the 1600s and 1700s has evinced me in some glaring critiques of the Republican form of government, which I am now of the mind is neither the best that can be done or can be had, nor is it anywhere near. In America, I recall a teacher once rolling his eyes and asking aloud how crazy people were to actually believe in the divine right of kings, for instance, a topic which clearly he only knew insofar as his opinion on it extended. And I do not believe for a moment he read anything by any pro-divine right writer of the time. There are secular benefits to such beliefs being instituted, and the practical effects numerous, if not obvious to all. I remember him teaching us about the Federalist Papers and that there weren't any lessons or encouragements or exhortations to cross-examine or to analyze from the perspectives of the time in the arguments against republics with any real credibility or teeth to them. This was also in a special class that I took on history, a sort of re-examination of what we had already come to know in elementary and primary school, for instance, about the American Revolution. And it occurs to me that people do not question republics, nor America's necessity in the world. Nor do they question whether or not the founding of America was in fact a good thing. They don't question what might be different if America had never been founded. Many might even shudder to think that, but never consider that perhaps such an alternate timeline would have netted a better world or way of life for them, or maybe even more freedom than they have today, or a better government if the American revolutionaries had just encouraged people to pay their taxes like normal folk and STFU. We can go into what might be different in another article, and I have a few ideas, but for now, let us wonder as to what that unquestionability and why questioning America earns one mockery and social and academical leprosy. I believe that part of the matter, or the root thereof, is that American students are taught the history of America quite young and quite very one-sidedly. Granted, to some degree, that is to be expected. But one hopes for a comprehensive and well-versed understanding of the reasons behind the founding on all sides, or at the very least, an understanding that wars are fought for reasons that are more than just one-sided, that there aren't heroes and villains by default in most wars, and that the arguments on both sides were good enough that people on opposing sides of a debate took up arms for their point and their cause. The British Empire is not stupid, nor is it a bully. The British Empire was a force for good. It was not tyrannizing America, or terrorizing them, or overtaxing them. King George III was actually not a tyrant. But to believe the hype in American history books, he was a bloody awful king. So why is he so beloved today in England? He had his faults, but is in no way viewed as a wicked or evil king. In America, they see him as a caricature, a complete distortion, but have no interest in correcting their view, and even when presented with fact and factuality, they are, in my experience, likely to doubt it, or tune it out, as though facts and truth were neither. Even when that is confirmed and is evident to them, they don't believe it, nor do they wish to revisit or revise what they have come to already learn, even if it was a complete bullocking of the truth. So what if the American Revolution was taught later on? So I believe that this is due to when the American Revolution is taught in schools, which I assert is perhaps even more important of a factor to this understanding of the unquestionability of republicanism in America, and that even the content of what is taught, what is left out, or how one-sided it is. American students first learn about the Pilgrims and who George Washington is in kindergarten. That is, before first grade, or grade 1. First, second, and third grades, with increasing detail, still one-sidedly, revisit the American Revolution again and again each year until about middle school. After that, the American Revolution is sidelined, as having been covered extensively already in favor of other history. But what does this actually do in effect is indoctrinate a one-sided war theory. My view and my hypothesis is that America has instilled in its students, and therefore in its populace later on, a one-sided war theory, which can actually be traced to the attribution of the mindsets that got us into wars such as Vietnam and Iraq. You have an entire generation of people having grown up that this is acceptable, a one-sided war theory, that you don't need to know what the other side has to say. You can just go to war and conquer. Ask the people of the Kingdom of Hawaii how that worked out for them. And so what this does, in effect, is indoctrinate this one-sided war theory and governmental model as being the only desirable model that there is or could ever be in their very limited exposure. Perhaps by design, this is done when they're children, during the years that they are forming their foundational pillars upon which they will rest and stand and stabilize their view of the world for the rest of their lives. And people tend not to question such pillars as those that are learned early on. They tend not to revisit them throughout their lives. If they did, not everyone would take it well if the world they discovered that they lived in this whole time was not the one that they always understood it to be. It could be a very profound and wonderful experience for some, but for others that could be terrifying, even unnerving. And so, the effect is the installation and the inoculation of Republican and American doctrinism and dogma for the average person's life. So a way to reapproach this without addressing the content, or what is taught, or more accurately, what is blatantly left out of what is taught, like the other entire argument, or why an examination of the critique of the pro-American argument with any real scrutiny is left out. Another way to reapproach it would be to teach the American Revolution for the first time to any real depth in high school, rather than before they lose their baby teeth, when children are past that formative period and are into a period where they are questioning things generally, even if not the aforesaid pillars right away, rather than when they're children, unquestioning of adult figures and authority figures like teachers and parents, whom they deem each as an actual authority, and will remember for the rest of their lives the things they're told. That act alone of teaching that in high school would in fact accomplish the goal of addressing the lack of whole information or cross-examination, because the students, at that stage in their academic lives, would do it for us. Thanks to puberty and the internet, they could actually question what they're taught about the American Revolution and get some real answers. You might even have a few more thousand monarchists in your town than you do right now if they did. And the Republicans that you would have, not GOP, mind you, term used traditionally, would be wiser and better Republic advocates for having questioned, looked, learned, and came to their own mind, rather than a series of manufactured patriotism tropes that they mouth the words and motions to, but they never truly grasp or understand. Every real effort to learn about republicanism ought to have as deep and as well-read an understanding and comprehension of monarchy, and vice versa, by virtue of what I would describe as any good research technique worth its salt and sulfur. One cannot just expose oneself to one side of one debate, because propaganda and jingoism become incorrectly understood as facts, rather than one of a two-sided coin. It would be like allowing a presidential debate but with only one candidate, and letting that candidate and his critique of his opposition not allowed in the debate or left out entirely, and his view of their platform to become understood as what their platform is, truly, and that it couldn't be anything else other than what they understand it to be. The downsides of equality. This is actually talking about you. A friend of mine who loves America and is sitting with me as I write this. I explained to him, and I believe he understood and thoughtfully considered what I have to say about the subject, about what I call the long lists of misters, and how republicanism, rather than advancing his freedom, protecting his opportunities, can oppress them by default of the system. Equality, I said, is not the same as equity. I hold equity to be the superior of the two. Equality and equity are not equal, and I thank God for that. Equality has downsides, I explained, a concept which would earn one strange looks in any American debate on anything. But equality, being put on a pedestal by all sides of all ideologies, but rather their understanding of it being limited to only American and Republican dogma and doctrine don't consider the logical endpoints of their equality-based republic. The homeless might be able to explain it to you, if this article is insufficient to illustrate and demonstrate one of equality's downsides. It takes an unequal one to liberate the equal many. One who is not like the others around him, to make any change in a republic happen of any real meaning or import. That is to say, it takes sometimes the principle of inequality to save the principle of equality. Rudolph was the one reindeer unlike the others, and look what he accomplished. Though he had to put up his whole life with a lot of reindeer games before he led them. The homeless, in Seattle for instance, are, en masse, herein referred to as such, and that reference is symptomatic of painting people with big and broad brushes, and I recognize that as I write this. But it suits both their and my purposes right now, even if that is not readily apparent, for these reasons. Each of them are equal, and so they're all on what I would call the long lists of misters. Even if the homeless all got together with people power, after all, as an often ignored and underappreciated and forgotten about and otherized, dehumanized, and stigmatized block or segment of people and society to unionize or organize, they would still find little success. And little success has been the result of almost all of their previous efforts to date, in most instances. You would think that not be the case. After all, they are, on paper at least, even if certainly not in practice, equal to those who ignore them in society. But equality becomes a millstone around their necks because of the unwritten and customary inequalities that people tacitly accept as the way things are, without thinking too hard about their absurdity or the obscenity insofar as toleration of their presence as factors in modern society. And so, a group of homeless organizers petition themselves. They make a case for their lack of providence, for their dignity, and for their humanization, to be treated as neighbors instead of don't feed the wildlife, as is so often the literal case. "Aren't you guys smart?" says a patronizing person to whom they present this petition, which they all, each of them, upon the principle of people power, signed. "Aren't you guys so smart?" says that person, puts their petition in a drawer. A whole bunch of misters. Why should she pay attention? They're all exactly the same. A Mr. bunch, not dissimilar to the Mr. individual that they probably presented it to. Remember, they are equal, aren't they? Yes, they are. And they are all equal when they are all en masse ignored. That list is set aside in a drawer and that petition will never be read. Because the majority that are not homeless still scapegoat them. And the individual Mr., just like they are, that they presented their long list of misters to, still aren't more misters than they are in the housed majority, whose opinion, in a system predicated upon the results of petty popularity contests, is ignorant, unbudging, and therefore, as their representative, by larger majoritarian numbers than the homeless petitioners, the individual mister that they presented their petition of long list of misters to patronizes them, but in the end, will ignore them, for politics' sake. Because their stigma would taint his electoral chances in the next petty popularity contest. Because no matter how much people power that they have, they're not popular. And popularity, not a constitution, therefore determines their quality and way of life. They will never upset that balance, or any apple cart, of their own power or their own capacities or their own agency, not even en masse together, short of revolution or societal economic collapse as an evener of their economic fortunes to that of the housed majority. So, enter now in he who is unlike all of the others and not equal. Likely misunderstood, if I do say so myself. And even amongst the homeless, whether he is homeless himself or not, probably not popular. Maybe he thinks he's better than they are, calling himself a lord or something. perhaps as popular as a monarchist in America. But if the homeless population can collectively get over their own scapegoating and shaming of he who is not like the rest of the group, which, by the way, is a common American tradition, going back all the way to witch trials, to shun the guy who's not doing what everyone else is doing and being horrible to that guy, if they can get over that, they will actually find in him, if agreeable to it, possibly their hero who can save them. Because they cannot, and they will not likely ever, of their own power, save themselves. Not because they're incapable, and not because they don't want to, and not because they can't or won't, but just because they are outnumbered in a system that's based on mathematics and economics, that divvies up power, horrifyingly enough, based upon the mathematical tally of participation, that of quantity, of those who support an argument, rather than the quality of the argument itself. That will be what most accord to at the end of the petty popularity process. And then, that's before we even get into the law of contrary effect. And so, it might be a little hard to hear, but equality is not the same as equity, and equal justice for all is, quite frankly, a lie that you tell yourselves. But the law of contrary effect is actually something that I call a principle in politics. It's my own theory that I came up with. If you try to institute equality by law, you will end up with inequality in effect. If you institute inequality in law, you will end up with, in effect, equality. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? But consider this. In the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, you got rid of the nobility, the dukes, the lords, and your official recognition of them. You put in the Emoluments Clause of the United States Constitution. By so doing, however, you got rid of the nobility as a check on the wealthy. They who were either wealthy or not wealthy themselves, after all, poor people can inherit crowns, kingdoms, and coronets, just as much as their rich cousins can. By so doing, you left a vacuum. The only people who filled that vacuum? The wealthy. But not the nobles, but the wealthy. Unlike the nobles, who were tasked with being virtuous and checking the worst elements in society, having power over them, without them there, that left an unchecked mark on the wealthiest of the wealthy, with all of the avarice, all of the greed, and all of the poor downsides that you were trying to prevent, except this time, with none of the responsibilities or expectations of them. They could just do whatever they wanted. And so, by trying to impose in law equality, you ended up creating the worst inequality that's ever been recorded in the history of mankind. You can see this law of contrary effect in England as well. In the United States of America, you have a separation of church and state. But there are, in some instances, and in some states, and in some Supreme Courts recently, almost nothing but, it seems, religious-based laws targeted with hurting other people, clipping or curfewing or curbing their rights, or scapegoating them, all in the name of religion. In the United Kingdom of Great Britain, there is no separation between church and state. The Church of England is the official church of the state. Church and state are the same thing, under the crown. And you never, on most occasions, I don't want to say never, but you rarely find laws being introduced in Parliament, either in Commons or in the Lords, that are designed to hurt people with religion as their basis. In the country that has a separation between church and state, you have, in some instances, nothing but religious-based laws trying to hurt people. In the country that has no separation of church and state, you have very few, if any, ever. And so, that would be the law of contrary effect. You try for A, but you'll get Z. If you try for Z, you'll get A. It's just how things work sometimes. And so, what we can see from this is, quite clearly, that the United States of America has a very complex history that's more nuanced than their textbooks or screening of The Patriot would ever give it credit for. By the way, The Patriot is a terrible movie that no one should ever see. It's the same thing as British or royal blackface. It's disgusting, and none of that, not one bit of it, happened. For the record, an officer like Colonel Tabington would have been drummed out of the British Armed Forces in an instant. Thank you for listening. You can catch me at hubpages.com/CastonGeorge.